Welcome to our live Q&A on the Hong Kong security law. I'm Kurumi Mori in San Francisco. China has introduced a new national security law for Hong Kong, and experts have said it will fundamentally change the territory's legal system. So to talk about what this means for Hong Kong and more, let me now introduce you to our guests. We have Karen Leigh, Bloomberg's China government editor, and Iain Marlow, Bloomberg's East Asia government editor, both based in Hong Kong. Thank you both so much for joining me today.
No problem.
Thanks. And for everybody else watching, please ask us your questions and comments, and I'll do my very best to get them answered throughout this whole broadcast. So first, what does the security law really mean for Hong Kong? To answer this, take a look at our explainer.
中央人民政府对香港特别行政区有关的国家安全事务负有根本责任。香港特别行政区负有维护。
This legislation is considered the most important development in the relationship between the central and Hong Kong government since the handover, and is a historic step in improving the mechanisms to safeguard the country's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and security.
Our main concern is that national security will be used as an excuse to silence opposition in Hong Kong. It will be used as an excuse to restrict the people's freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. Everything will be, done on the grounds of national security. But is it really to prevent national security being endangered, or is it used as a way to silence opposition?
So as you saw there, world leaders have already reacted to the law. The U.S. House of Representatives passed legislation that would penalize banks doing business with Chinese officials who implement the law.
The law is a brutal, sweeping crackdown against the people of Hong Kong intended to destroy the freedoms they were promised. Beijing's so-called national security passed on the eve of the 23rd anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong from the UK to China signals the death all moral authority to speak out for human rights any place in the world.
Yeah, you just heard now Speaker Nancy Pelosi. So Karen, how does this law affect U.S.-China tensions?
Well, it's a big one. And I mean, there was this brief period of calm earlier in the year in January before the pandemic where, the relationship between the two of them looked pretty calm, and it's worsened dramatically in the last few months, even the last few weeks, on a number of fronts, everything from Taiwan to the coronavirus to Hong Kong, and the U.S. really going after China on its human rights record, not just on Hong Kong, but on its treatment of ethnic Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And the U.S., this is something where Trump is saying this week that this is making him angrier and angrier. And the U.S. has threatened to take away some of, if not all of, Hong Kong's special trading status that makes it unique from the mainland, that really underpins its status as a safe place for international business. And this is something, they've really come out, strongly against it. And I think that this is something more than anything right now that's a flashpoint to watch as relations worsen between the two of them.
Yeah, and Iain, can you jump in on this, the U.S.-China tensions, how that has changed or how that will change?
Yeah, exactly. I think last year we saw Hong Kong become a huge flashpoint between the U.S. and China, particularly between the Trump administration and Xi Jinping and the local Hong Kong government here. The protests obviously went on for months last year. They became a sort of rallying point for U.S. Republicans to jump in and criticize China and the broader sort of approach that Xi Jinping has taken to the country, as Karen says, on everything from Uyghurs to human rights and Hong Kong's democracy. So I think a lot of people expect this law to, it's already worsened relations. There's already been threats and actual retaliation. So I think this is just another moment where Hong Kong is becoming a sort of, it's just caught in the middle between the US and China. And it's something that a lot of people in the US can recognize and relate to in terms of democracy. Maybe they haven't heard of the Uyghurs and Xinjiang and some of the other issues in China, but a lot of people have heard of Hong Kong. A lot of people recognize Hong Kong is democratic. They remember the protests last year, and they see this law, I think, in that context.
Okay, and you both live in Hong Kong, right? So you're pretty close to what's happening. We're now going to go to some live Q&A questions from our audience. The very first one is from Twitter. Will the United States, the UK, the European Union go to help the people of Hong Kong? So will Hong Kong people get help from outside?
Well, that's a really timely question. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson said yesterday that the UK is going to offer 3 million Hong Kong citizens who hold British national overseas status the path to full British citizenship. And he told Parliament that the law breached the Sino-British Joint Declaration, that it violated Hong Kong's autonomy. This is after he'd expressed deep concern about it. And that came right after the US Congress said it was considering a bipartisan bill that would give refugee status to Hong Kongers at risk of persecution under the law. And this was introduced just hours after the text of the law was released. It's being led by, among others, Florida Senator Marco Rubio, who's a noted China hawk. And I think if either of those avenues comes to fruition, you're going to see a lot of at-risk people leave Hong Kong in the next couple of years.
And when you say at-risk people, what does that mean?
China said this week that this law is a sword of Damocles hanging over the heads of its most outspoken critics. And people here are really concerned that it's going to really clamp down on those basic freedoms that Hong Kong's always enjoyed and that also help distinguish it from mainland China. And they're worried that it's going to be used to really quell dissent, make it impossible for you to criticize the government, to criticize China. So there's a lot of people here on the activist side, the opposition side, people who've been out protesting, who are really worried about what this is going to mean for them. And if any of their past actions or anything that they do today is going to put them at risk of arrest, So I think that for a lot of people, they're going to be looking at where else they might be able to go if it suddenly becomes apparent that they can't be here anymore.
Right.
It's a great question, just in terms of what other countries can do, because I think this is something that a lot of countries and governments around the world are struggling with. I mean, not every government is as powerful as the United States. So there's other countries that are dealing with China on a bilateral issue, say Australia with their trade issues and trying to seek some responsibility or accountability from China for the coronavirus pandemic. Canada with the extradition of Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei executive, and now there's 2 Canadians detained in China. There's a lot of countries that have these sort of simmering issues with China, and everyone is really struggling to figure out what sort of policies do you actually pursue? How do you approach China? And I think that the US has tried these very kind of overt economic issues. They're either sanctioning Chinese officials, going after maybe their bank accounts in the future. They're doing visa restrictions. doing trade restrictions and other things. So it's the UK's move on citizenship is quite new and interesting and unique in the sense that obviously this is a former British colony. So it hits at a broader issue about how exactly do countries deal with China right now.
Right. And this next question from Twitter we have asks, does this in turn mean that even the UN Human Rights Council would not be able to debate or criticize the new law without risk of arrest or some kind of backlash, I guess, in China?
This is a really, really fascinating topic because the new law came out yesterday. The text was released at 11 p.m. on Tuesday, and it came into effect roughly at the same time. And the law was only in Chinese at first. So, if you were a citizen of Hong Kong who didn't speak or doesn't read Chinese, you were subject to a law you didn't even understand as of 11 o'clock last night. But I think now it's sort of an issue where people are just trying to see how, how this law actually applies in Hong Kong. And I think we're all kind of just waiting and seeing how everything sort of boils down. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, primarily you should be looking out for how exactly this law is going to be interpreted by authorities. And the timing of it really can't be ignored. We've been talking about how it came into effect just ahead of yesterday's anniversary of the return to China in 1997. And this is a hugely symbolic occasion here. It's usually marked by mass protests. Last year, we saw 500,000 people come out. And this year, we just saw a couple thousand. There were hundreds of arrests, and they were the first under the bill. And that included 2 people who were holding Hong Kong independence banners. So that gave us a little bit of insight into what the government is looking for in terms of offenses under the law.
So again, would this security law quell the Hong Kong protests? Would it really make the protesters stop protesting? Does it really instigate this fear? What do you think about the Hong Kong protests and this law?
I think for sure. I think people in Hong Kong have been a little bit more fearful of protesting than last year, for sure. Once the national security law was announced in late May and details started coming out, the police seemed a lot more proactive in terms of going after and arresting protesters. Not just at protests who are doing violent things, but on their way to protests, kind of searching their bags for gas masks or protest equipment as they were getting out of the subway or something like that. But back to the original question of whether this would quell sort of debate about Hong Kong overseas, and I think that was one of the interesting things that came out in this law was that it actually has global jurisdiction. So if you are technically under the law, if you are a Hong Konger who lives in the United States and starts talking about Hong Kong independence or supporting or even funding protest groups, you could find yourself violating the law even though you live in the US. And I think that's, I was speaking to some lawyers yesterday, and it sort of raises all these strange questions about, say, what happens if you are a UK civil servant working in the foreign ministry, and it's your responsibility to draft, sanctions against Chinese officials, or it's your responsibility to approve, refugee status or asylum status for Hong Kongers who are running away from China. You could technically find yourself in violation of that law just for doing your job, and you could conceivably see in the future Hong Kong or China making extradition requests to the UK, to the US, to European countries based on people violating this law. A lot of lawyers think that this probably won't result in people actually being extradited to China, because a lot of those treaties have clauses that exempt them for political offenses. So if someone commits something that China sees as bad, they don't have to go through the rigmarole of sending someone back to life imprisonment for writing an article that someone likes. But it's a very interesting question.
Yeah, and I mean, some of that, that trying to clamp down on stuff that's happening abroad could also be happening because activists could be moving out and trying to, fight for Hong Kong freedom from overseas. And, I think that there was a bit of covering the bases might have been part of the logic behind that.
And what do you both think of the timing of this new law? What do you make of that?
Interesting timing. We talk about this the timing of it coming, hours before the July 1st anniversary of the handover. And last year on July 1st, we saw really significant protests, and there were so many people out, and it was such a hopeful day. And, to look at the contrast a year later where this law has just come down, barely anybody came out. I think that they were trying to effectively, I mean, Iain can jump in, but I think that they were trying to make sure that we didn't see a repeat of last year this year. And trying to make sure that, these protests stay small and that people get the message.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was always the question of how long these protests might last. I think obviously last year they went for 7 months. They went all the way from June basically until January when the pandemic sort of landed in Hong Kong earlier than a lot of other cities around the world. But I think one of the things when you saw these pictures last year of huge marches with 1 million people, close to 2 million people, if you were down in those rallies like some of us were, you see a lot of families, some older people, kids, people pushing strollers. It was a big affair, and it was sort of a big tent approach to the movement. But as the risk started increasing with the risk of arrest or of violence, just kind of blasting out at one of these protests, like getting a tear gas canister lobbed into the middle of a peaceful march, a lot of the moderates started staying home. And I think now you've got a lot of those moderates are probably no longer attending these rallies and sort of padding them out to the size that we saw last year. So I think even yesterday, most of the groups were, there were maybe hundreds of people at a time, but you're not seeing like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands like we did last year.
Yeah, the footage we're watching right now is from 2019, from last year, and they're just you see so many people on the streets there.
Yeah, and I mean we saw so many people come out, tens of thousands of people, last month for the annual Tiananmen Vigil, and they defied social distancing rules and came out anyways. And to look at the contrast just less than a month later on this next significant date, right after the law was passed, was pretty stark. And we've seen, as Iain was saying, we've seen the shape of the protest really change. Who comes out, how many come out, the tactics that they use, and they had calmed down during the coronavirus. We'd seen like 4 or 5 months where there wasn't much of anything, and then in recent weeks we started to see this resurgence. A lot of that was fueled by the anger over this law and over a separate national anthem law. And we thought maybe they're going to resurge and we're going to have this, second summer of unrest. And we were all talking about, how big they would be, and maybe they would be smaller but more violent, and trying to get our heads around it. So to see that, the law came down and not that many people came out, that was a pretty, stark thing for us to see.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. So we are going to go actually to the next question, and this is from a Facebook viewer. Is the judicial independence in Hong Kong still trustworthy? And what impact would this have on investors? Very, very Bloomberg question. Iain, help us answer this one.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of two questions in a way, right? I think the first one on judicial independence is something that's worrying a lot of people. I think there's a lot of lawyers and people who follow the legal profession here who are extremely concerned about this law, because what it does is basically layer mainland style law onto a jurisdiction in Hong Kong that was traditionally under the British common law legal tradition. It was distinct. I mean, I'm sure most people are pretty familiar with the fact that Hong Kong has a distinct sort of political system than the mainland. But one of the main things about that is the courts, and the courts are they're independent. Their judges are respected. They act as arbiters of regional decisions around Southeast Asia and elsewhere. So, and it's also a place where a lot of companies, international businesses base themselves, because if something goes wrong, if there's a contract dispute with a Chinese supplier or something like that, and you get a ruling out of a Hong Kong court, it can be trusted. So the thing now is that this law basically says it overrides all other Hong Kong laws. So if there's any conflict between the national security law and another law in Hong Kong, it just the local law doesn't apply. And so that, to a common law legal tradition, is pretty extraordinary. And a lot of people have been pointing out all these small details within the law that make it pretty incompatible with the way Hong Kong has traditionally done it's justice. And so, the Hong Kong chief executive, Carrie Lam, can appoint judges to panels overseeing security cases. She can also dismiss judges after, either a set term or because they say something publicly that suggests they don't appreciate national security. So there's all sorts of things in there that would be very, very, damaging in another jurisdiction. And I think a lot of people now are just saying this means that, Hong Kong's courts may not be able to be trusted, at least on, national security cases, and in some cases, increasingly political cases.
Yeah, and I mean, you have to remember that, decades ago, international business would come set up here because it was a gateway to China, and China in a large way depended on Hong Kong financially. And that's completely changed. They don't anymore. And people are now wondering if this is actually a place that's going to be distinguished from the mainland. If you have legislation that's going to, as Iain said, give Carrie Lam the power to pick judges, if you have legislation that's going to let Chinese security agents operate in the city. So I think that this is really, I would say, Iain can disagree, but I think this is probably the biggest factor in worrying people about, the future autonomy here.
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree with Karen. I think the other issue on the second question about whether businesses are actually concerned about this law is an interesting question as well, because it is basically impossible to speak out against the law as a company here, because it would immediately endanger your executives, your employees, your business and market share, either in the mainland or in Hong Kong. The most prominent example of this was HSBC. Is big, it's been here for ages, but it's technically a British bank. When the national security law was first announced, it hadn't even come out, it hadn't even taken effect yet. They just didn't say anything about the law, and they got criticized for being silent. And so and they came under pressure, and eventually one of their executives came out and signed a petition supporting the law, to kind of give the impression that the bank supported the law. And so now you basically have a very clear indication that any business that sticks their neck out and says this law is bad for business will be criticized. But at the same time, there's a lot of sort of maybe more conservative people in business who just want stability. They want an end to the sort of unrest and protests that happened last year. There is a strain of opinion in Hong Kong that that maybe this law, because it will reduce the protests, it will lead to stability and maybe prosperity, and the city can get its reputation back. But at the same time, as we were kind of saying earlier, the introduction of this law, the way it's being introduced, and the questions it raises about Hong Kong's judicial and political systems actually creates a lot of uncertainty for business here. If you're an economist publishing research about Chinese banks, or maybe a Chinese initial public offering or something like that, where a company is going on the stock exchange, and you say something bad about that bank, what if that company is a mainland, like, state-owned business, and you say something bad about it? Will that mean that you are subverting China's authority in Hong Kong? No one actually knows right now. And I think those questions have been percolating over time in Hong Kong, but I think this law makes them very, very real.
Yeah, we know there's a big expat community in Hong Kong. Here's a question from our Twitter audience. At Brandysoul asks, how will the law affect American companies who will have to adhere to guidance in the U.S.? Karen, got an idea? how they'll be
guidance? I'm trying to think specifically what you mean about guidance in the U.S., but something else to look at is where people are going to go when they leave here. And the region is always changing, but we often cast Singapore as the regional rival as a financial hub. Tokyo has motioned this week that it would like to attract people if they're leaving Hong Kong. Could even go to Taipei, which shares a lot of the same language and culture as Hong Kong and the mainland, and has also welcomed people. So I think those are probably three of the bigger places that you're going to see people go, especially if it becomes impossible to operate here separately from China.
I think with some of I mean, following U.S. laws and stuff here, I think companies have traditionally always found themselves in a bit of a pickle, so to say, with Hong Kong, in the sense that if you operate here, you get to enjoy the benefits of being in Hong Kong. So if you're an American company, a bank or something with a bunch of employees in Hong Kong, they can enjoy, the lifestyle of Hong Kong, which is generally a lot higher than on the mainland. And it's also a low tax jurisdiction, which a lot of people like. The taxes are much lower than the mainland, both for your personal income tax, but also for corporate tax. So people enjoy those benefits by being here. But I think increasingly it's just companies here are facing a reality where increasingly there's a bunch of limits to what you can do here in terms of free speech or publishing certain research. And I remember one person I was speaking to a while back, when the law was first sort of coming out, he was saying, Hong Kong may remain a place where you can sell shoes across Asia. So if you're a company that does something like that, maybe Hong Kong remains an okay place to have your company based. But if you're doing research, or if you're doing sort of more sensitive things, say you're an academic who studies censorship in China or something like that, Hong Kong may not be the best place to base yourself going forward. And I think that's something that a lot of people are sort of grappling with right now. And a lot of it depends on how the Hong Kong government sort of interprets the law and how aggressive China will be in taking these cases on themselves, which they're allowed to do under the law. Beijing can kind of step in and say, what you've done is so egregious that we're going to prosecute this ourselves.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, American companies also have to worry about not just the business side, but employee safety, whether it's, foreign staff or local staff. And we've seen a lot of people taking down their Twitter accounts in the last couple of days and worrying about things that they might have posted or said in the past that could get them in trouble, and people just generally unsure what actions might land you in hot water under this law. So I think, that's the other thing to consider is, are people going to want to come here, from the US and work for an American company, especially when relations are so bad between the US and China right now, and especially when China has a history of perhaps making examples of people from countries with whom they're having a diplomatic dispute.
Definitely another concern. We're going to go back to some viewer questions. We have one via Periscope. What is the risk to the Hong Kong dollar?
That's a big question here. I think that, in addition to the judiciary and trying to figure out how this law is going to be interpreted, whether or not the Hong Kong dollar peg is going to remain safe has been one of the biggest questions we've been talking about for months. There's been no indication, at least that I've seen, that peg would go. But if it did, I think that's a worst case scenario for business.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people kind of refer to that here as the nuclear option. That's something that would really sort of impact the city. Some of the other things, like taking away the trading status, those are big things that, to be frank, were kind of inconceivable last year during the protests. They were sort of mentioned, but it was always like, oh, no one's, the US is never going to do that. That's going too far. And now we're kind of already there. So it shows how quickly expectations can change with the US-China relationship as bad as it is right now.
So taking into account everything we know so far, what are the next steps we should be watching for?
I think we've already seen a couple of arrests under the new law. So I think the immediate next thing that we're going to be looking for is not just the sort of geopolitical sort of US reaction and what Trump does and this kind of stuff, but within Hong Kong, how aggressively they pursue these charges, what kind of sentence will this person get? There was a person arrested for just having a Hong Kong independence flag. So that was violating the law on secession, on kind of wanting to separate Hong Kong from China. What does having a flag that says that, what kind of sentence does that get? Is that like a 3-year sentence? Is it a 10-year sentence? Is it life imprisonment because you advocated it? Is having a flag more advocacy than if you have a book that says that in your bag and you're caught by police. I mean, no one actually really knows what these laws mean. They came out Tuesday at midnight, and a lot of people only read the English translation if they didn't read Chinese the following day, when the law had already taken effect. So these are, and it's a huge law. It's you know, I think 35 pages long, and it includes a broad array of things. So I think how the Hong Kong government even interprets the law, I think is a major question right now.
Yeah, and the other thing is how they crack down on activists on the opposition in particular. There's a key election here for the Legislative Council in September, and the opposition in recent months has been increasingly worried that they're going to use this law to punish critics of China, or to disqualify them from campaigning. So we're going to be watching that as well, and I think also just watching to see, you know, prominent opposition figures who might get swept up in all of this. There was a sweep a couple of months ago, I think, Iain, of I think there were 15 people who were arrested. So we've been kind of bracing for something similar and waiting to see who that would be and what they say the offenses were.
Right. Iain, you just mentioned earlier. Sorry, let me get to this next Facebook question that. Basically, it was 35 pages. This Facebook user asks, how clear or vague is this security law?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think that the main thing right now is that a lot of the crimes, even though we've been waiting for details for weeks, basically a month on this law now, the law that's come out is still incredibly vague. I think the crimes and offenses that it outlines are vague, and it's not clear what qualifies as subversion, what qualifies as secession, or colluding with foreign forces. Even terrorism, which is something that a lot of people would say, okay, I think I know what terrorism means. Terrorism now under this law could mean disrupting traffic or disrupting the subway, which is something that the protesters did a lot last year, where they kind of put up barricades or they disrupted people's morning commutes as a way of sort of driving their message home to ordinary people in Hong Kong. So the people that we've spoken to have said that, I mean, it's deliberately vague. It means that the government can now have a large degree of leeway in saying, okay, well, what you did applies under the law. So it has everyone kind of questioning what they're doing, right? So, if I have a book on Hong Kong independence, is that arguing for independence? I have a flag, if I have a flag in my room, but it's at home and then the police come in, is that in violation of the law? It's like, it has people questioning in a similar way to the mainland, what would fall afoul of this law.
Okay, let's go to the very last question. Obviously, pretty vague. This Facebook user asks, so how does this affect every country who has a national security law? Does it? Karen?
I mean, we're still trying to figure out what it's going to mean on the ground here. I think, at this point, the most we can draw on how it will affect things internationally is this caveat that it could affect anybody anywhere. And what are how do these two laws play against each other? If you commit an offense under it and you're in the UK, how does that square with UK law? Are you still, are you still able to be prosecuted somehow? Are you charged in absentia? Is the UK under any responsibility to send you to Hong Kong? I doubt it. So I do think that it could raise some interesting legal questions, but we have to see how it plays out first. At this point, we still are trying to figure out what the sentence would be for somebody who got arrested under it at a protest.
Right.
Yeah. China's pointed this out a couple of times, as they've been pushing this law, which was everyone else has a national security law, so Hong Kong needs one too. Yeah. And why are you criticizing us? You're just, it's hypocritical, it's double standards. So they've been very much sort of using other countries' national security legislation to justify their own. And it's worth kind of adding that Hong Kong is actually constitutionally mandated under the Basic Law, which governs Hong Kong, to implement similar legislation. And so since the handover, governments have a government tried in 2003 and it didn't work. There were a lot of protests, and they haven't really tried again since. So a lot of people were expecting this legislation to pass through Hong Kong itself, but they were never able to do it. The opposition, in some cases, kept filibustering on certain other bills, so they figured they probably wouldn't be able to get one through. And then Beijing just said, enough is enough. We're imposing this law on you. They bypassed the city's legislature and just sort of wrote it themselves, basically. So the end result now is, China justifying the national security law based on other people's national security laws, but doing it in a way that, really has a lot of people in Hong Kong worried and questioning what falls under national security.
Right. Not knowing it could be frightening. Just before we wrap and end this broadcast, I've been seeing several questions, the same question, which is about the upside. Periscope user asks, you've talked about the downsides, which we have, but what about the upsides? Are there any upsides?
This is the strain of thought that Iain was talking about, where there are people here, they are not the majority, who think that this will calm the protests and get the city a bit more stable and back to normal. But, polls have showed, and everybody we've talked to really has showed that it's not popular. People really don't want this law. But there are people who do have that view.
I think during the protests, it was the general coverage in general showed a lot of the views of the protesters and a lot of the views of people who were sort of against the protests or were sort of pro-China. Often, I think sometimes, they weren't featured in a lot of the news because in some ways, China has a habit, and the United Front is sort of a branch of the Communist Party that promotes policies overseas and in Hong Kong. And so there's a lot of groups here that have been out protesting in support of China's government and policies and things like that. But they tend to be very, very small groups. They seem to be very organized. They often have matching T-shirts. They're all waving flags. On Wednesday, yesterday, when there was a lot of protests, there were some kind of pro-China protests that came out. So I think it's an important reminder that in Hong Kong, even though a lot of people are worried about this law, and in the last kind of local elections we had, 85% of the seats went to the pro-democracy side. There are still these, I don't know how many people it would be. It's sometimes hard to know with the polling and kind of petitions that go around about how many people actually support the law. But there are some people who, support the government and don't like the protesters. And that's just a reality in Hong Kong, like it's a reality in every other city that has, protest movements and things like that. So, but in a lot of ways, they're just saying what China's doing is great. And there's no sort of engagement. And I think that's one of the sad things about this whole process is that, even moderates weren't consulted. So people who may think, okay, well, throwing a Molotov cocktail is clearly bad, but on the other hand, censorship is bad. That person may find themselves in the middle, and no one's asking them what they think, and no one, China didn't consult anyone like that. Lawmakers that have those sorts of views before the law was passed.
Okay, well, that wraps things up for us. I think we're going to end it here. We got a lot of great questions and great answers. Thank you so much to our special guests, Karen Leigh, Bloomberg's China government editor, and Iain Marlow, Bloomberg's East Asia government editor. And thank you, everybody, for watching us. Let us know what you'd like to see in our next Q&A by leaving a comment below, and follow us at QuickTake and at Business. Bye for now.